video wasn't on until right now. So there was no record of what just happened. But I do need to get this on. I'm going to have somebody pray for us. Let's see. Okay, will you pray for us when I give you the secret signal?
In English, please.
Hope you're enjoying this time. Many people are studying for Hebrew, but also time to prepare for the Old Testament exam, which will be next week at this time. You have the essay questions, so you know how to prepare those, putting together your notes. Welcome to our guest here. This is Old Testament 1. Let's see here. Okay. Right. Okay.
Let us pray. O God, if the virtues of an apostle, prophets, and psalmists and be added, and we can build in that church the religious congregation of men and women, grant, we pray, that led by his counsels and helped by his grants, he may have literally work for the salvation of souls. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen. Okay, I think we're live here on the video. Today we're continuing. I wanted to say some overview things about the historical books. I probably will do that next time, but I wanted to get into Joshua some today, and some of the questions about Joshua are a little bit different from the schedule, but we'll pick up that intro to the historical books. So, as we saw, the Pentateuch actually ends outside the land of promise. It ends actually in the plains of Moab, where Moses has given his final sermon series before early retirement. And because he also fell to unbelief, along with his brother Aaron, they had to die outside the land with the Exodus generation. So it was only Caleb and Joshua who were from that other generation that were able to enter the land. Then Joshua becomes the successor to Moses in the next book of the Bible. And so let's open up to Joshua. Remember, Deuteronomy ended with the death of Moses. And next we have the story continuing into the Promised Land with the leadership of Joshua. So if we look at the structure of the book of Joshua, we have a prologue in chapter 1 that lays out Joshua's authority, because there's in a way, a crisis of leadership, because Moses was this great prophet of God, and all the signs and wonders done by God in Egypt were done through Moses. And so now he's no longer leading the people. So Joshua's authority needs to be established here at the beginning of the book. And then we have a discussion of the conquest of the land in chapters 2 through 12, followed by the division of the land in chapters 13 through 22. And then there's an epilogue of Joshua's farewell and the death of Joshua at the end, the passing on to the next generation. But in fact, there's no leader over all of Israel after that point, and that's where we come to the book of Judges, where there is no central leader, and Israel breaks into its tribes, and it becomes basically a tribal situation of chaos in the book of Judges. But in this book we have still a single leader, but Moses was the prophetic leader of Israel, and Joshua will become a military leader, a military man. Let's go back. Let's look at this prologue to the book to see how Joshua is presented here. So Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan, together with all this people, into the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads, I give to you, as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness and the Lebanon to the great river, the river Euphrates, on east, the whole Hittite country, and up to the Mediterranean Sea on the west. No one shall be able to resist you as long as you live. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. And remember, we've discussed Exodus chapter 3, this call of Moses to bring the people out of Egypt. And in Hebrew class, we actually looked at the Hebrew of that description of God's name. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be who I will be. And in the context, we saw that it said, God explicitly explains that Ehyeh imach, I will be with you, the same verb, I will be with you. So rather than this being some kind of statement of absolute being, although that's true of God, it's actually a statement of God's being with. And that same phrase is now used here of Joshua. Ehyeh imach, I will be with you. The exact same phrase. I will be, as I was with Moses to bring Israel out of Egypt in salvation, I will be with you to bring the people into the promised land. So it's connecting up with this character of God seen in the Exodus. Be strong and resolute, or your translation might say, be strong and courageous. For you shall apportion to this people the land that I swore to their fathers to assign to them. But you must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teaching. Now, this is surprising because when you first hear this language of being strong and resolute or strong and courageous, you're expecting the next thing will be and fight well, right? Because they're going to take the land. They're going to try to defeat the inhabitants and claim the land. And this is language of battle or military strength. Be strong and courageous. But it goes on to say how you're to be strong and courageous is by keeping the Torah, the instruction that Moses gave. So be strong and courageous in study. Good message for seminarians. Be strong. That's what Joshua is supposed to do. This should be reminiscent of this odd picture of the king that we saw in Deuteronomy 17, right? The king in Israel is not like a king like all the other nations, but this king is to be a student of the Torah, the instruction of God. And also, Joshua is a surprising military leader. He's a military leader by studying, keeping this scroll of teaching that Moses has passed on. Losing my projection here. So this is probably those sermons, that teaching that Moses gave in Deuteronomy that he wrote in a scroll that he left behind him. Do not deviate from it to the right or to the left, so that you may succeed wherever you go. So you will succeed in your military campaign by keeping this instruction, not by being the strongest or the smartest, the most powerful, but by being the most faithful to the teaching that I gave through Moses. Do not let this book of the teaching cease from your lips, but recite it day and night. So why from your lips? Well, because or mouth. See, yeah, or mouth. You could also translate it from your mouth. It shouldn't depart from your mouth. Why? Because you will be reciting it, saying it. Remember, actually, we just saw this in the Hebrew class. Kara in Hebrew is the word for read, but it also means to call out loud. And there's no word in Hebrew for silent reading. Reading is always a public proclamation. So this reading that he's doing, that Joshua is to be doing, is actually to be speaking it over and over again and to be memorizing it. So that's why it's in his mouth. And then it says, uses the Hebrew verb hagah. Here translated recite. You might have, does anybody have meditate? Meditate. That's another translation that's often used for hagah, but it's actually not very, it's a little misleading because we have different connotations we associate with meditating. Okay, so this is a type of meditating, of repeating in a low voice over and over again this text of the instruction of Moses. Only then will you prosper in your undertakings, and only then will you be successful. I charge you, be strong and resolute. Do not be terrified or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So, God will be with him now, not in the same way he was with Moses, because now he's subject to the teachings of Moses. So Joshua has a different sort of authority, a secondary type of authority where he's under this teaching that God has given, and he has to follow it, and by following it, he will have success in the conquest. So this is actually the beginning of the historical books that follow the Pentateuch, and we're going to see that throughout these books, everything that happens is evaluated according to this Torah Moshe, this instruction of Moses. It's as if the authors are reading this. They have it beside them as they're writing, and they're evaluating all these events. And so right from the beginning, Joshua's leadership is going to be evaluated in these terms. All right, so we're going to do an overview here, and then I want to start to get in to discuss some of the ethical issues that are involved in this book. This is one of those places where those questions come to a head, I think. So that's what we're doing today. So in 5 through 10, we have the central and southern campaigns. And represented here by first the green and then this kind of orange line here down into the south. So what we're going to find is that basically these are summaries, and we don't get an account of every battle. They're very selective, and we just hear certain stories, and we just kind of get an overview, and we don't get a detailed and elaborate chronicling of everything that they did in the land. And so I just want to give you this overview here, and then we'll start to look and see about what stories the authors have selected out of all. Because presumably they fought a lot more battles. The battles that are given, that are mentioned, are not enough to actually take all the land. So why did the author choose these narratives? So then in 11 you have the northern campaign. Is this just a schematic of that movement there up into the northern part of the land in chapter 11. So let's pull back now to look and see in more detail what's going on here in these chapters. In keeping with this initial perspective on this peculiar type of leadership that Joshua has to have as a military leader, we also see that as they enter the land, they're actually, instead of being a battle column, they're actually portrayed as a religious procession, which we can appreciate around here, though we haven't been having as many as we normally do. This is how it's. We already saw this actually in the Pentateuch with the movement of the tribes and how they had the ark and the tabernacle parts, and they were carrying it. And it didn't really look like a very strategic military maneuver that they were engaging in. This continues here. They process into the land, across the Jordan River and into the land with the ark. So let's go to Joshua sends the spies into the land again. Now remember, there were 12 before, 12 spies. How many were faithful? Well, how many were faithful? Okay, you saw I gave it. 2 were faithful, Caleb and Joshua, and 10 said, we can't do it. There's no way we can take these guys. They're too big, too powerful. Now he sends 2 spies. I think that's intentional, that it's, as there were 2 faithful spies before, he sends 2 now. And they spy out the land, and they're helped by Rahab. And then let's go to chapter 3 and look and see how they're crossing the Jordan here. Early next morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and marched to the Jordan. They did not cross immediately, but spent the night there. 3 days later, the officials went through the camp and charged the people as follows. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being borne by the Levitical priests, you shall move forward, follow it. Okay, so it's the ark that is leading them into the land. But keep a distance of some 2,000 cubits from it, never coming any closer to it, so that you may know by what route to march, since it is a road you have not traveled before. And Joshua said to the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will perform wonders in your midst. Then Joshua ordered the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and advance to the head of the people. And they took up the ark of the covenant and marched at the head of the people. The Lord said to Joshua, this day, for the first time, I will exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they shall know that I will be with you. See that? There's that language of being with you again, the exact same language. As I was with Moses. For your part, command the priests who carry the ark of the covenant as follows. When you reach the edge of the waters of the Jordan, make a halt in the Jordan. And Joshua said to the Israelites, come closer and listen to the words of the Lord your God. By this, Joshua continued, you shall know that a living God is among you, and that he will dispossess for you the Canaanites, etc. The ark of the covenant of the sovereign Lord of all the earth is advancing before you into the Jordan. Um, let's go to verse 14. When the people set out from their encampment to cross the Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant were at the head of the people. Now the Jordan keeps flowing over its entire bed throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the bearers of the ark reached the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark dipped into the water at the edge, the waters coming down from upstream piled up in a single heap a great way off at Adam, the town next to Zarethan, and those flowing away downstream to the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, ran out completely. So the people crossed near Jericho. The priests who bore the ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry land, exactly in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed over on dry land until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. So, does this sound familiar? What is it like?
Crossing the Red Sea.
Okay, it's like the crossing of the Red Sea or Reed Sea, where in that case the water stood up on two sides because there's a sea. This is a river, so it's standing up on one side, but it's supposed to be it's showing that this is the same God who's involved here, and Joshua is like Moses. He's a new leader leading the people. This is kind of a new crossing of the water now into the Promised Land. And they set up stones as a testimony. Yeah, let's move to verse 5 now. I'm sorry, chapter 5, not verse 5. When all the kings of the Amorites on the western side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the sake of the Israelites until they crossed over, they lost heart, and no spirit was left in them because of the Israelites. Everybody's getting scared. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and proceed with a second circumcision of the Israelites." So Joshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Gibeath Ha'aralah, which means hill of foreskins, aptly named, because that would be the result of that. Now, this is really important. What's going on here? Okay? What's going on here? This is the new generation. And we didn't know this until this point, but in fact, they were not circumcised. The men were not circumcised as children. So God's own people now entering into the Promised Land. They've crossed over. They're in the Promised Land. They're about to take the Promised Land, and they haven't circumcised them. They haven't been circumcised. They haven't kept the covenant of Abraham. Does this sound familiar? Have we heard anything like this before? Where have we heard something like this before? David?
Moses' child.
Yeah. So I mean, not a story you typically hear in Sunday school, but we did spend a little bit of time on this very obscure story, the bridegroom of blood incident, where after Moses was called to go to Israel in Egypt and bring them out, on the way, his life was at risk. His life was threatened by God because he hadn't circumcised his son. So, for one thing, we hear that they haven't been keeping the covenant already, and so everything is kind of in question here, even at the beginning. But also, we see that it's a weird way to prepare for battle, to circumcise yourself. That's a very strange way to prepare for battle. But if this battle is actually being fought in God's power, and it's based upon not human strength and prowess, but actually faithfulness to God and dependence upon God, keeping the covenant, that's the most important thing you can do. So from the very beginning here, it's presenting Israel in a very unorthodox kind of way, as their whole victory depends upon God, not upon their own strength. And what they can do is be faithful to their God, to keep the covenant, and to obey Him. And that's going to determine whether or not that they are actually successful in taking the land. Verse 9, the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So that place was called Gilgal, as it is today. And that's a word play. They love these word plays. So something that happens there is, and there's a word play on the name of it. Gilgal means rolling. So God's saying, I rolled away this past the past sin that you were dealing with. Verse 10, encamped at Gilgal in the steps of Jericho, the Israelites offered the Passover sacrifice on the 14th day of the month toward evening. On the day after the Passover offering, at that very day, they ate of the produce of the country, unleavened bread and parched grain. On that same day, when they ate of the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Okay, we haven't been hearing about this, but they've been dependent upon this bread from heaven. Probably kind of like pastry from heaven, which sounds good to me, but they got tired of it after a while. And there's a word play. Mana means what? It's a question mark with an interrogative particle. Ma means what in Hebrew, and na is emphatically asking a question and entreating something. So it's and I don't know if you remember, there was this candy bar. I haven't seen it around recently, called whatchamacallit. This is actually the Hebrew version of whatchamacallit, the manna. What is it? So, but we haven't been hearing about this, but that was what was keeping them alive, basically. They were kept alive in the wilderness by this manna that they had to go gather daily, and they couldn't store up. So it ceases now because they can eat from this land that they arrive in. Do you notice that they celebrated the Passover? That's their preparation for going into battle, to keep the Passover. So the author's choosing all of these different rituals and aspects of covenant relationship with God, and showing that those are the things that are most important here. Verse 13, just a little bit more here at this point. When Joshua was near Jericho, so this is before their first great battle, he looked up and he saw a man standing before him, drawn sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and asked him, "Are you one of us, or of our enemies?" Okay, one of us or one of our enemies. He replied, "No." None of the above. None of the above. "I am the captain of the Lord's hosts." By the way, Lords of Hosts, that's not a sacramental reference, just for all you Shoga students out there. Okay, these hosts are armies. Hosts, Lord of Hosts. Lord of Hosts. Armies, angelic armies. That's what the title Lord of Hosts means when it's used of God. I mean, God commands angels who are pictured in the Bible as armies. Powerful armies. David, you just have to get a comment in on that one.
I'm just asking, like,
okay.
Are you joking, or do people actually think that?
No one that I know of thinks that.
Oh, okay.
I'm joking.
Just wondering.
I'm joking. I'm making fun of myself. and of ourselves. Yeah. If you actually thought that, we won't ask you to raise your hand. So, but not people. I do think people aren't really quite sure what that means, Lord of Hosts. But Tzava is an army, and Tsevaot. You've seen that Adonai Tsevaot or something like that. Might be how you saw it. That's the phrase Lord of Hosts. Tsevaot is what it is in Hebrew, which is the plural of armies. So it's fitting in this context because we're about to find out who is this man. Just appeared like a man to Joshua. I am the captain of the Lord's host. Now I have come. Joshua threw himself face down to the ground and prostrating himself said to him, "What does my Lord command his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host answered Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Where have we heard that before? The burning bush. That's what. And who was it who was speaking in the burning bush? Okay, was God speaking through Malach Adonai, through the angel of the Lord. So, you see how if you read continuously in the Bible, and in this case through the Old Testament, and you start to get a sense of the larger context, you see these patterns that keep being repeated, that we keep seeing, right? That's how it's designed to work, that you're supposed to be noticing these connections and noticing these relationships as a reader. To say, in a way, this is like Joshua's burning bush, right here, right before his mission begins in the Promised Land, in the conquest. And the same language is used, remove your sandals. Now the other one referred to Sinai, right? It was the mountain of the Lord, which was apparently known as the place where God appeared, even to before Israel got there. That was this holy place that Moses happened to be shepherding the flocks. Now it's being said, this land is holy land, a holy place. Why? Because God is there. Now, God is with them. That's what God said to Joshua, "I'll be with you." So God and his hosts are there. This is really important because it's saying, it's fitting in with this perspective on Israel. You are not able to do this in your own strength. What are you supposed to do? Circumcise, keep the Passover, carry the ark, follow the ark, all of these things that Israel's supposed to do. And the idea is God will fight for you with all of his hosts. And here we have this commander of God's hosts, this angel of God. And then we don't hear about that in the rest of the story. We don't hear about angels fighting. But the idea here is that it's actually God fighting for, and the angels of God fighting for the Israelites, and that's the only way that they're going to win. Okay, because it's an impossible task that they're undertaking right now. Okay? All right. Okay, so what happens in chapter 6? In Jericho, this is selected by the author to be here in great detail. We assume that this was the first battle, but it's also getting a lot of attention. It gets a lot of attention in the narrative, and a lot of other battles are just simply either omitted or they're just summarized. So we want to spend time understanding what's going on here. So it's continuing these themes that we've been seeing. So they're supposed to go around the city with warriors. Notice all the numbers of 7. 7 priests with 7 trumpets, and the ark carried by the priests. You're going to go circle around the city, blowing their trumpets once a day for 6 days. This is how they're supposed to fight this battle. You see how weird this is? Instead of the number of people, it's more important how many, it's that there are 7 priests and 7 trumpets. 7 is a number of what? Holiness, isn't it? The 7th day that God set apart as holy. 7 gets used often as a number conveying holiness. So then another pattern of 7. On the 7th day, circle the city blowing trumpets 6 times. Then on the 7th trumpet blast, the people are to shout. And this is really a kind of sonic warfare, because they're going to take down the city by blowing trumpets and shouting at it. How can they do that? Only if God fights for them. So it's like this declaration of faith that they carry out what God told them to do. This absurd way of attacking the city. But they do it by faith, and it's just this declaration. We're trusting in God, and as they do so, God topples the wall of the city, and they're able to go in and invade the city and destroy it. But you see that it was God who did it, not the Israelites. You follow that? You see how that works? Okay, that's what this first story is illustrating. When Israel trusts God, God will give them victory and will give them possession of the land. Not by their own strength, but by God's strength. So we get into here something called the ban. It's translated different ways, but the Hebrew word is herem. That's a great example of a segolate noun, Hebrew students. Herem. Herem. Not harem, but herem, okay? Don't confuse those two. That's different. So we can look at a passage in Deuteronomy, right? Because it's like they're okay, we're invading the land here, and they're reading Moses' Torah. Okay, let's see what we're supposed to do here. We're going to keep this, follow this. That's how we're going to invade this land. So Moses had laid out these guidelines for the herem. And we go back and read in Deuteronomy here and see that happening in Joshua 6. When the Lord your God brings you into the land, Moses says in Deuteronomy, that you are about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. That's the verb haram, related to the noun herem. So it's utter destruction is what this is about. Make no covenant with them. Show them no mercy. Okay? And so that's what we see them carrying out then in Joshua chapter 6. And we have a 9th century BC standing stone or stela of Mesha, the Moabite king. And it references the same practice. So here's part of the text of the Mesha stela. Chemosh said to me, this is Mesha, the Moabite king's talking. Chemosh, his god, said to me, go, take Nebo from Israel. So I went by night, and I fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants. For I had devoted them to destruction, or herem. It's the same word. For Ashtar Chemosh. Okay, so it's his god or a consort of his god. Maybe the consort of Chemosh. So this actually, it's quite fascinating because we have this is an external source that attests to the practice of herem and to a battle that actually appears in the Bible in 2 Kings 3. This is where this story actually happens. But we're getting the Moabite perspective in the Mesha stela. It's very interesting. So, but for our purposes here, we're seeing that this was actually not unique to Israel, but it was a practice in the ancient Near East. It's not the only way of doing battle, but it's a particular way of doing battle, the total destruction that is in some way dedicated to or dependent upon a god. So he did it for this deity, carried it out. So that's the practice we see happening in the Bible, right? So we've already seen numerous examples where it's not that these things are unique or brand new in Israel. There are lots of similarities to their cultural world, but there are also differences in the ways that they appropriate these different practices. So this is another one of those examples, this practice of total destruction. So, we're starting to move now into the ethical discussion and the morality that's involved here. But one of the things we learned from this is that it's not that Israel was particularly cruel in doing this. This was actually what peoples in the ancient Near East did. And it was a kind of divine warfare that was related to the gods. So it appears like Israel's doing something that all these other ancient Near Eastern nations also practice.
Yeah, I think the same thing living around with Rome. You know, the Carthago de la Gas, they was to destroy it.
Okay, so other examples that would be later, but yeah, there are some other analogs to it, right? So let's start to think about this. Here I have a little quote. Does the Bible teach genocide? That's the question that many people are asking, and you are going to hear, you have heard, maybe you've asked yourself. And I have this quote from Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion. And this is kind of a hard quote. It's got some pretty long words in it, so I haven't practiced it. I didn't practice it, but let's see if I can do it well. This is what Richard Dawkins says. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Okay, notice fiction, not in all literature or something, but in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Okay, I did okay. I didn't do it perfectly, but so he makes the couple claims in here: an ethnic cleanser and genocidal. Okay, so this is just a quote. This is just a particularly kind of pungent quote expressing this, but it's a common topic, common question, common wrestling that people have. So now Dawkins is an atheist, so he doesn't believe that God exists. So, but he's using this as the depiction of God in the Bible as an argument against this God. Anyway, we'll come back to that kind of theological question or theological context. So what I want to do is to give you some suggestions for about how to have a conversation about this. And I don't claim to have, the one answer that's the final answer that makes it, solves the problem. But I have some things that I think can help us, okay? And in these discussions about moral qualms that people have with the Bible, first of all, we have to understand the interpretation of the Bible we're dealing with and try to figure out is it accurate, okay? Because it could be there's a problem in our understanding of the Bible. And we got to get clear about that. And the Bible causes us plenty of problems, but we got to have the right problems with the Bible, okay? Because we also have lots of problems that, maybe we don't need to have because they're based on misunderstandings of the Bible. So there's understanding the Bible accurately, and then there's understanding what's giving us these problems with what the Bible says, okay? Because these issues can come from both of those sources, okay? So some of these things that I'm going to offer are trying to get clear about what the Bible actually says. All right? That's the beginning of this discussion, and that's where I think it's important to start. So, again, if you've taken any class on logic or argumentation or debate, one thing is to say, wait a second, are these the terms of the question I want to answer? Because the terms of the question, of any question, set the parameters for answering it. And if you accept the question, you accept certain assumptions. And maybe you do want to do that, or maybe you don't want to do it. But in this case, I would suggest let's stop before answering the question and try to understand the terms of the question. Okay? So the question is, or the assumption of it is, that God is depicted as engaging in ethnic cleansing or genocide. Okay? So I suggest that those aren't the right terms to use, and we don't want to start to try to answer the question yet until we get that clarified. Okay? So then we'll start to go into the biblical evidence about this. So what is genocide? Well, genocide is the deliberate killing of a large group of people because of their race or ethnicity. That's the definition of genocide. Okay? That's the reason why they're being killed, is simply because of their race or ethnicity. Race groups people by physical characteristics, and ethnicity groups them by their cultural identity. Okay? So it could be skin color, but it could be other physical characteristics that race looks at and groups people. Now, I'm problematizing using this term, okay? Because the Canaanites would actually be considered the same race as the Israelites. They're not of different races, okay? So it can't be genocide in that sense. They have the same kinds of physical characteristics. And in fact, the Canaanites don't constitute a single ethnicity. They don't have a homogeneous culture that's at odds with Israel's culture. They have different ethnicities, different cultural context. Now, there's some religious differences, but actually, culturally, there's a lot of diversity within Canaan. I mean, when we just read these passages, it lists all these different people groups, right? Those are different ethnicities within the land. Okay, it listed 7 different ones. Which is probably just a summary way of summarizing to list the 7 as a kind of complete whole. Okay, so the practice of cherem is theological and geographical, rather than being racial and related to ethnicity. So the reason given in the Bible is actually that the Canaanites worship other gods and they practice things that are regarded as immoral. That's actually the reason, that's the thing that sets them apart. And also that they live in this land. Okay? So God is laying claim to this land for the good of his people, and not just his people, but a much greater group of people, all the families of the earth. Remember the purpose of the blessing to Abraham in chapter 12? It was so that this blessing will come through Abraham and restore the original primordial blessing that God gave to all people. So God has a bigger plan than just his people. So, and also remember, we've talked about this before, that God can actually be dealing with different people differently and doing so at the same time. So he's dealing with the Canaanites and holding them accountable for their sins. That's how the Bible presents it. They've sinned against God, not by breaking the covenant, but by breaking general moral expectations that God as the Creator has upon them. So he's dealing with them in punishment, and he's dealing with Israel in providing a land for them that he had promised to them. So both things are happening at the same time. And it's based upon these geographical and theological categories, not upon this categories like genocide. Okay, do you follow that? So I'm complicating it, and then I'm saying what is it actually about in the Bible? Okay, so let's start to look at 5 different responses that I would give, or 5 different things about the biblical presentation. Okay, and I'll just lay them out right here, and then we'll go and look at some examples of each one. So first of all, there's also an assumption in these discussions that, one, that the Bible is depicting genocide, which I'm problematizing, and 2, that it has kind of like a go and do thou likewise approach. Like it teaches genocide, like as if the reader is supposed to read that. Now, it's not to say that people haven't read the Bible and committed violence or used it that way. But the question is, was that the right reading? Was that what they were supposed to do? So I'm arguing that the Bible actually is not saying that the reader should go and do likewise, but that it actually depicts this as a unique event that's not to be emulated. It's not to be repeated. And in fact, Israel fought many wars and battles, and this is there's one other example of the Amalekites, but other than that, this is the primary example of Keren. It's not something they practice all the time. It's only in this case. Okay, we'll look in more detail at that. Number 2, God was patient with the sin of the Canaanites for 400 years. So the Bible depicts God is not just the God of Israel, he's the God of all the nations, and all the nations have a relationship to him. It's different for Israel because they have the covenant. But it actually indicates that God was being patient with the Canaanites, as we've seen God being patient with Israel for many years, and will continue to be patient with Israel for many years. He was patient with Canaanites for over 400 years before he punished them for their sins. Number 3, God mercifully spared some Canaanites in special circumstances. So actually he made exceptions to his own rule. It wasn't that every single person was annihilated. Number 4, like the Canaanites, Israel was also subject to God's judgment. So again, another assumption in this discussion is, how triumphalistic Israel was. They thought they were so much better than everybody else and that they could do this to people. But actually, within the book of Joshua itself, there's a critique leveled at Israel and a threat to them that this will happen to you too if you sin like the Canaanites. This is actually the continuing story of the rest of the historical books, that they do act like Canaanites. And eventually, they are removed from the land themselves. Many of them die there, and some are exiled. So it's not a case of Israel or God's people are so much better and they get an exemption. They also can be subject to what happened to the Canaanites. And then number 5, as we start to get into a larger theological discussion, what is the assumption about who God is in these biblical texts? As the creator, the Bible assumes God has the right to destroy or to spare his creatures. So, Richard Dawkins doesn't believe that because he doesn't believe in God, but that's the perspective of the Bible, how the Bible thinks about it. Okay, and for people who affirm that God exists, it's something we have to reckon with. Okay, that whereas something might be wrong for a human to do, that God isn't subject to those same kinds of restrictions or the same kind of moral evaluation that humans are. Okay, so let's look in some detail at these. Okay, so there are other examples of each of these, but I've pulled out a few to show you. Okay, so in Deuteronomy chapter 4, we have a discussion of this conquest in the future, that discusses it as a unique event, not as something that they're supposed to do all the time, or that even the reader of the book should do. It's like, don't try this at home, kids. Like that's the perspective. Don't go and do likewise. Has anything so great as this ever happened, or has its like ever been heard of? Has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, by terrifying displays of power? This is talking about what God did in Egypt, which was, remember, it was supposed to be a picture of who God is, a revelation of God's character to Israel and to the Egyptians and to any others who ever hear about this and know about this. This is who God is. To you it was shown so that you would acknowledge that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. He brought you out of Egypt with his own presence, by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves, to bring you in, giving you their land for a possession. So it's talking about the uniqueness of this sequence of events, and that the conquest is part of it. Not just something that happens over and over again or multiplying, but this one time in this special act of God to create Israel and drive out nations before them. A good example of the God's patience idea is in Genesis 15. Genesis 15 is the first covenant with Abraham. There's actually two covenants with Abraham, 15 and 17. 17 is where he gets circumcision, and in 15, it's the covenant of the parts, where the animals are slain and making the covenant. But there's a fascinating discussion of the future of the offspring of Abram here. The Lord said to Abram, "Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years." He's talking about the Exodus. So, Abram doesn't even have a son yet, but God knows what's going to happen in the future. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, the Egyptians, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, back to this land. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. That's a short little note that God puts on the end of this discussion, but it has a lot of significance in terms of thinking about what's going on here. So God is promising, I'm going to bring you out of Egypt, out of this foreign land. It's not named Egypt here, but back to this land, so your offspring will possess this land. But he says, the reason why it's going to take this long is because I'm looking at the iniquity of the Amorites. And so it's probably a metonymy for all these different people in the land. They're one of the groups of the people in Canaan. Okay, a metonymy meaning like a part of something that's standing for the whole in this case. So this one people is standing in and representing all the peoples of the land. I'm dealing with you over here on this side. But just so you know, I'm also dealing with these other people and these other issues over here. And I'm watching them and I'm seeing they're sinning, they're committing iniquity in my eyes. But I'm patient and I'm going to keep waiting and I'm going to keep waiting and I'm going to give them more than 400 years. But eventually I'm going to say enough is enough. I'm going to punish you for your sin after so long. And then I'm going to bring you and your offspring into my land. See what's going on here? So it's actually being presented as not these innocent people who didn't do anything, but people who've been committing an immorality for hundreds of years, and God is being patient with them for that long. That's how the Bible is depicting this. At the same time, God has a plan that's going on for Israel. to give them this land. Okay. Some examples of God's mercy. God spared Rahab and her entire family. Rahab the prostitute, by the way, not the most reputable occupation, and her entire family because she turned to God and helped the spies in Jericho. So there were exceptions to the cherub. If Canaanites trusted in the God of Israel and turned to their God, they could be spared, as we have a detailed example in Rahab and her family in Jericho. God spared the Gibeonites, who tricked the Israelites into making a covenant of peace with them. They were spared. Another exception. So they weren't supposed to be spared. The Israelites weren't supposed to make a covenant, but the Israelites were naive and let themselves get fooled into making a covenant. And God didn't have to observe the covenant that Israel made, because he told them, don't make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, but he respected it. He allowed them to spare the Gibeonites because they made this covenant. And in Judges, we hear that there was a larger group of people that were never defeated in the land. So it's not something we hear about in Joshua explicitly. We hear about these other exceptions, but this other group of Canaanites that God allowed to stay because Israel wasn't being faithful to him. He spared the Canaanites whom the Israelites failed to drive out and used them to discipline the Israelites for their disobedience. We start to hear about that in the book of Judges. So even though the depiction in Deuteronomy and some of the summary statements in Joshua gives us the picture that they in fact annihilated everybody, other parts of the biblical text indicate there were exceptions based upon the faithfulness of the Canaanites or the unfaithfulness of Israel. God allowed exceptions. Israel's responsibility. Let's look at Leviticus 18. It says in Leviticus 18, "You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances and commit none of these abominations." I don't know if you read Leviticus 18 very often. It's probably has an adult rating on it, but it's basically laying out all these practices, these deviant sexual practices, according to Leviticus. And it's saying these are the things that the Canaanites do. This is the sexual ethic of the Canaanites. Don't follow their example. You're not to engage in these practices. So even people who are sojourning among you, don't let them engage in these practices. For the inhabitants of the land who were before you committed all of these abominations, and the land became defiled. So here's another perspective on the sin of Canaan. It's in purity terms. That, these hundreds of years where they were living there and living in sin from God's perspective, they were defiling the very land that they were living on because of the things they did. And God is purifying the land. He's purging it of these people and of this impurity that they've built up there by bringing Israel in. So, that's a different perspective on the same idea, a purity perspective on it. But look, this is actually directed to Israel, and it's a threat to Israel. Otherwise, if you act like Canaanites, I will treat you like Canaanites, God says. The land will vomit you out for defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. So you see here, it's not that Israel is better. They have a superior place only because of God's gracious gift of the covenant and the things that God has done for them. But God says, if you act like them, I'll treat you the same way too. So it throws it back on a theological issue about whether or not God is justified in doing this with anybody, rather than saying that Israel justified or is exempt from something. It's actually God saying, this is how I'm consistent. I'll be consistent. If you act like them, I'll treat you like them. And sadly, we know this actually does happen in history, subsequent history. David?
Does this imply that the law of God is not, I guess, simply within the covenant with Israel, but that there is a universality to the law?
Yeah, I think this is how I would put it, that sacrifice and purity regulations address a universal problem rather than that those laws apply universally. So it's saying that this is there are features of a results of sin that actually all people live with. And Israel lives with them too. And God gave them the sacrificial and purity systems to address that so that God could live with them. With the ultimate purpose eventually that God can live with all people, but he begins his mission and his purpose in Israel. So does that make sense? So it is granting that, yes, it's not just Israel's sin that defile things, it's all people's sins that defile themselves and the earth. Defiling the earth is a concept that when humans sin, not just by damaging the earth or whatever, but just in their own morality, it can actually taint the earth. This is a biblical aspect of sin that we don't think about that often, but it is granting that this is going on in the rest of humanity too. Yeah.
The defiling the earth seems to draw it back to Genesis, the creation story, and the first sin.
Yeah, and I think of Cain and Abel too, because remember what God says. His blood cries out from the ground,
Right.
Which is it's a personification of blood, but it's some idea that there's something in the earth itself that is wrong now that. It was a man who got killed, but it was the earth is crying out, or the blood in the earth somehow, So this connection to the land is there.
It seems like in the genealogies we read, it seems like the old, like in Genesis especially, it's trying to say that there's an appeal to the universality of all people. It seems like what Genesis is trying to do is trying to say from, these original people, so to speak, come all of. Obviously everyone, but that includes like the Canaanites.
Yeah.
So in a way, Israel's claiming our God is still the God of the Canaanites.
Yeah. Right. I mean, yeah. So Israel, in Israel, there's both a particularistic aspect and a universal aspect, and those two things are both true. There's the election of Israel, but there's also the idea that this God is the creator of the world, which is different from these other peoples who would say, well, these are our gods. It's like, each people and land have their own gods. And our gods are we just deal with our gods and you deal with your gods. That's their idea in this polytheistic context. So in Israel, there's this idea, we're dealing with our God, but our God's dealing with everybody. Right. Whether we know it or not. And so you get these glimpses of God's activity, among other peoples and God's purposes for the whole world too. Gavin?
No.
Okay. So then drawing back to a larger picture of the larger biblical context, the theological issue. The real question is, I think, does God exist? And if God exists and is the creator, then does the creator have a right to deal with the creation in this way? And there are several biblical texts that talk about this, that address this larger theological question. So we'll take two from the prophets and one from the New Testament. So in Isaiah 45 it says, "Woe to you who strive with your maker, earthen vessels with the potter. Does the clay say to the one who fashions it, 'What are you making?' Or, 'Your work has no handles.'" So it's saying, how absurd it would be if you were making a pot and the pot said, "You're really doing a bad job at this. What are you doing?" Or you didn't add the handles. Who is the pot to tell the potter how the potter wants to make it? Okay, so he's saying, Isaiah's saying, people who are arguing with God are like pots arguing with the potter. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. Just like the clay. So there's this. I'm tracing this potter theme. Okay, this metaphor, the potter and the pottery. "Just like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel," God says. "At one moment I may declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it." So here it's not just in the case of Israel, but in all the nations, God is doing these things. God's active in these. Sometimes he's protecting them and preserving them. Sometimes he's allowing them to be just defeated or overthrown. "At another moment I may declare concerning a nation or kingdom that I will build or plant it." So I'm like a potter, and the nations are like the clay in my hands. And so are you, Israel, just one of the nations. And St. Paul says in Romans 9, "Who indeed are you, human being?" He's drawing on these Old Testament passages of the potter to argue with God. "Will what is molded say to the one who molds it, 'Why have you made me like this?' Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use?" So, just a couple minutes left. So let's wrap it up on this point. So I think that in answering the question, we want to say, let's get clear about the terms of the question. Okay? If someone's talking about genocide or ethnic cleansing, let's get clear about it. Let's look at the biblical texts and try to see how do they present it on their own terms, because a lot of times we misunderstand biblical texts and that creates problems for us. And then let's work with that. That's still, you could be clear about what the Bible says, and not agree with it, and struggle with it, or have questions about it, but that's getting the problems in the right place, or getting the right problems. Okay. So, and then I think a lot of this gets back to our problems, because it's a human propensity to try to be the judge and arbiter of truth, and to say, well, what right do you have, God? I know better than you do. I mean, that's where we like to set ourselves up. Okay, so that is I think getting the focus of a lot of the problem where it comes from a lot of times, and try to say, okay, if it's the case that God is real, as opposed to Dawkins, who actually believes that God doesn't exist, so he's just trying to undermine the biblical narrative, and so God exists and God is the creator. Then what does that mean about what God can do, or what kind of standards God should be evaluated by? Well, the biblical understanding is that God has this freedom All right, if you have questions, we can wrap this up next time. If you have questions, I want to hear your thoughts. We'll have to wrap it up next time.
I'm actually
Oh,